Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to all of you. And I'll try not to get preachy by the end of this, but I may do that because most of you know that I'm a demographer and also know that demography is a divine calling. Now, we know it is because there's a book of Numbers in the Bible. It's all about censuses. Check it out. You'll see that I'm correct. What I really want to talk about today are the population changes that are impacting America and what they mean relative to the very topics that we're dealing with here. Now, I want to apologize for some slides that will look like this. I have a friend, well, actually I have two friends, but one of my friends has told me, he says, you know what I like about you, Murdock? You take about 600 numbers, put them on a slide, put them up in front of a bunch of people, and you say, as you can plainly see. And I also want to apologize. You'll see several slides in here that compare Texas, U.S. kinds of things, because I use them, of course, in my work in Texas. And do understand, of course, that you see these kind of slides because Texas does like to compare itself to other nations. But you see that this last decade, for example, was a decade in which we had relatively slow growth as a country. That is, the growth in our country was second slowest only to the Great Depression decade, which was caught in the 1940 census. But despite that, we added 27.3 million people. I want to also kind of get through some very simple things to understand. And that is one of the biggest understandings in the United States is that we're growing because of immigration. That's not true. About 2/3 of our growth is natural increase, the excess of births over deaths. And you can see in the United States, in the period for which we don't have all the birth data yet, but 62% was that. International migration, we know that about 5 or 6 million of that was due to undocumented immigration. The rest was documented immigration. You can see where growth has been, and growth was greatest, of course, this last decade in Nevada, and less in Michigan, Michigan being the only state that actually lost people. And we know, of course, what this meant in terms of redistricting. That is reapportionment, which is the important part of the census, and that's what's in gold and the blue. The gold were the states that lost seats. The blue are the ones that gained seats. These are the states, and this is really more important, with the largest numerical population increases. You can see Texas was there with about 4.3 million. Then you had California, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. None of those would be likely to have any kind of natural disasters, of course. And you can see the rest that fill that out that have other kinds of potential natural disasters. So growth has unfortunately not just occurred in places that were less prone, but in fact has occurred in places that are more prone to various kinds of natural disasters than others. This isn't in terms of percentage increases. Again, what you will see is where they are. And I want you to ask you a very simple question. How many of these states are in the northeast or midwestern parts of the United States? None of them. None of them. That is because when you look at our total growth, and not just this decade, but for several decades, about 85% of it has been in the South and the West. These are the rapidly growing parts of the United States. And as a result of that, if you look at what's happened to our population, in 1900, 62% of the people lived in the Northeast and Midwest, and 38% lived in the South and the West. By the 2010 decade, 40% live in the Northeast and Midwest, and 60% live in the South and the West. I would argue that this is a distribution that has not helped our cause here very much. It's put more people into areas more likely to be impacted by the kind of events that you're studying here. This also shows something else. This is the 10 largest cities in the country. And remember, when you look at that growth, the only one of those that had faster growth than the country as a whole was San Antonio, Texas. Our large central cities have continued to have slow growth. They haven't been revitalized as we all hoped they would be. It has still been suburban growth that has characterized urban growth. Well, why is this a problem? This is a chart you all know better than I do. This is just some recent data on looking at the last decade or so in terms of incidences that we're all worried about. But I want you to look at this. This is the total U.S. population growth. And I want you to note that of the total growth, that which was due, and NH up here stands for non-Hispanic, the total growth due to non-Hispanic white populations was 8.3%. Meaning that basically 92% of all the growth that occurred in the United States was due to minority populations, with the leading group up there clearly being, with 15.2 million people, the Hispanic population. And that population is not just dominant anymore in terms of growth for the Southwest, for a few states. It's not a Florida, New York, Texas, California phenomenon. It is a national phenomenon. In fact, if we look at it in terms of our youngest population, here's what we see. This is the population under 18, our children. We would have had the largest decline in the child population since the 1930s had it not been for the growth in the Hispanic child population and in the Asian child population. But I want to do something very simple now to get you an idea that this isn't, these population changes I just discussed are not just a few areas. I want to do that by a very simple thing. I'm going to take various population groups. I'm going to show you national maps. I'm going to show counties. And if an area was growing with that population, it'll be in blue. If it was declining, it'll be in red. So let's start off by looking at the non-Hispanic white population. If you look at this, what you see is that in about 1,700 of our counties, the non-Hispanic white population was declining. In about 1,500, there's about 31 something in the total, there was growth. Now remember, red is decline, blue is growth. This is the non-Hispanic white population. This is the Hispanic population. So if you think there's Hispanic population growth only in the Southwest, only in New York, look at this map. The reality of it is increasingly a national phenomenon. This is the African American population. Very mixed bag. The counties up there that are in a kind of pinkish pattern are those that have too small a number to measure change. And finally, this is the Asian population. We are seeing much more, not only rapid, but dramatic distribution of growth in minority populations and in others. Well, the other issue we have, of course, is the aging of our population, and we've been beat over the head with this a great deal. But I want to just let you look at this map. This particular chart. This is the United States, and this is 2000. And the blue up there represents Anglo or non-Hispanic white, and Anglo is a southwestern term. And the red is the minority population. You notice the 65 plus, notice that there's about 84% of that population is non-Hispanic white, about 16% is minority. But notice what happens when you get up to this particular period of time or this particular age groups. The younger the population is, the more likely it is to be minority. And now let's look when we look at the future. This is the Census Bureau's projections. And you'll see up there that the only age group by 2050 in which the non-Hispanic white population is the dominant group is the 65 plus population. Well, let's look a little bit just for a minute at the future, and then we'll talk about the implications in terms of why this is really important. This is the Census Bureau's most recent projection. This is over there on the right-hand side. That's in thousands, so that's 435 million people. This projected, 439 million is projected to be the increase from 2000 to 2050. When you look at that increase, that's 157 million people. Of that increase, the amount that is expected to be due to the non-Hispanic white population, the number is 7.6 million out of 157 million. On the other hand, the amount expected to be due from the Hispanic population is 97.2 million.
Why don't you just keep that up there just a minute? I mean, he's going through so much valuable information here.
Okay. Well, I can slow down, but I want to leave some time. This should get a very clear idea that if when you think of the population and you look at our population right here, all of us here, or almost all of us here, would fit into this category. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit more about what that means. Of the total population increase, that means that 5% will come from the non-Hispanic white population. The rest will come from what our populations that we now refer to as minority populations. And we will have a population for that infamous period of time we hear about the impact of the baby boomers, but will make our population so that 1 in 5 Americans is 65 years of age or older. That happens about 2030. You can see that you had those. But why do we care about this demographic change? Well, you all know and can clearly understand why we care about the numbers. And if I showed you projections by state, they'd be in those very states who are at the top of the cycle from 2000 to 2010. But I think the reason we should care about the change in composition is that due to a variety of historical and discriminatory factors, these populations also have certain socioeconomic characteristics that affect their ability to react and respond to disasters, and affect as well their ability to recover from such disasters. Now, why is that the case, and what do we see here? Well, this is from the American Community Survey. That's what we demographers use now to talk about population characteristics. And I want you to look and see the differences here in poverty rates and in income between different racial and ethnic groups. So, for example, if you take poverty levels, 8% for Anglos, again, remember that's not Hispanic whites, and 25% for African Americans, 23% for Hispanics. And notice as well, because these dollars here are in 2009 dollars, notice what's happened from 99 to 2009. It turns out that the most significant of those differences, and all in the negative direction, are among the non-Anglo or minority populations. They have experienced substantial and real decreases in income and increases in poverty in the last decade. So, what do we see in terms of education? Because much of what we do here is meant to help educate people. And you look at the less than high school level of education, 39% of adult Hispanics have less than high school level of education. Go to the other end, 31% of non-Hispanic whites have a bachelor's degree, about 12% for Hispanics. This means very large differences not only in resources, but in the ability to use many of the programs that we might design. So what am I saying about all of this? I had to show you this because I could tell that many of you were deeply moved. I'm saying the following. We are going to have and continue to have substantial population growth. Not necessarily at the levels we had in the 60s or 70s or 80s, but substantial levels of population growth. That growth is going to increasingly involve minority populations, not non-Hispanic whites. And people will say, well, how can you be so sure of that? I can be sure of that for a number of reasons. First of all, non-Hispanic white fertility has been below replacement now for nearly 30 years. The average non-Hispanic white woman in the United States is 41 years of age, and therefore unlikely to have a big boom, at least, in the number of children. And immigration would have to come from Europe, the oldest and slowest growing part of the world, and the only part of the world that the United Nations projects to have an absolute numerical decline in population between now and 2050. Our growth, and we are a vanishing breed. And there's no other way to say it. The reality then that our population will be increasingly involving minority populations, and that is no problem in any other way except if these socioeconomic differences are not addressed, and hence we have the incomes and educational levels up there. Because many of those populations that are worrying about how they're going to pay for rent next week find many of the things that we worry about every day to be nice things to worry about if I only had the time and resources. We have a challenge. I sometimes call it the American challenge. And that is the challenge to ensure that all Americans have the skills and education they need to be productive and hence to do well economically, but equally important to have the resources to be able to respond to the kinds of natural disasters, the kinds of problems that we deal with here. I argue that the challenges for us are not only to do all the things that we're talking about today, but to ensure that we're doing them in a way and a manner that gets to not only the current population of the United States, but the future population of the United States. Thank you very much.